In this video, we take a look at a story that happened in 2003 in the American state of North Dakota. On November 22, 2003, 22-year-old Dru Sjodin was walking to her car after finishing her shift and was talking to her boyfriend on the phone. Suddenly, the conversation was interrupted. Dru's boyfriend didn't pay much attention to this, which he later regretted very much. Soon, the young woman was talked about on national TV channels, and what happened to her contributed to a change in U.S. law. Dru Katrina Sjodin was born September 26, 1981, in Minneapolis, Minnesota. She was the younger of two children to her parents Alan and Linda. When Dru was 3 years old, her parents divorced but kept their friendship. From age 10, she and her brother Sven were raised by Linda and her second husband, Sid Walker, a travel agent in a comfortable home on Whitefish Lake, renowned as one of Minnesota's most scenic vacation spots. Dru blossomed in high school, becoming an honor student, joining the golf team, and getting elected homecoming queen in 1999. But her real passion was for art. Her room at home was filled with her sketches of rock stars, models, and her friends. After graduating from high school, she went to the University of North Dakota Grand Forks, a city of about 50,000 people. Friends described Dru as a person in love with life and ready to lend a helping hand to everyone. She often traveled around the country, but her dream was to visit Australia, and Dru was going to go there in the spring of 2004. In preparation for the event, to save up more money, Dru worked 2 jobs in her spare time: a sales associate at Victoria's Secret and a waitress at a nightclub in Grand Forks. On Saturday, November 22, 2003, Dru's shift at the Victoria's Secret store, located in Columbia Mall, ended at 4 p.m. Later that day, she was supposed to work at a nightclub. Before leaving the mall, Dru decided to go shopping and bought a purse from a certain store. She called her boyfriend, Chris Lang, as she made her way to her car in the parking lot. Suddenly, after Dru said, "Okay, the call was disconnected, but Chris didn't give it much thought. There was nothing important they were discussing, and so he didn't call back. About 3 hours later, Chris's phone rang again, and it was Dru calling. When he answered it, all he heard was a noise, like the sound of the wind and the sound of buttons being pressed on the phone. 3 weeks later, in an interview on a television station, Chris recounted the thoughts that flashed through his mind when his conversation with Dru was interrupted. "I did not know the sense of urgency of this phone call at the time," he said. "I never in a million years dreamt that this was happening. There was no sense of urgency. More just a cell phone call being cut off for any number of reasons. Honestly, I had no idea that this terrible thing was happening." Dru was living in a college dorm where she shared a room with a friend named Meg Murphy. About the same time Chris received a strange phone call, Meg received a call from the nightclub where they were trying to find out why Dru hadn't come to work and wasn't answering the phone. She was a responsible employee and always came to work early, so her absence immediately caused everyone's concern. However, Meg didn't know where Dru might be and was surprised that she hadn't shown up for work. Trying to find out where her friend Meg had disappeared, she first called mutual acquaintances and then called the local hospital, where she was told that Dru had not been admitted there. Around 9 p.m., unable to find out anything, Meg called the police. Knowing that Dru worked at Columbia Mall, a police officer was dispatched there. At this point, the mall was already closed. Driving around the parking lot, the officer saw Dru's car. Upon examining it, he found that the car was unlocked. There were no signs of a struggle or any other crime. A black nylon sheath from a folding knife was found on the ground near the car. It wasn't clear yet whether it had anything to do with Dru's disappearance, but such a find was not encouraging. On the seat in the car were papers, a wallet, and a new purse purchased that day, suggesting that even if Dru had faced some dirty deed, it certainly hadn't been a robbery. Neither friends, boyfriend, nor parents knew where Dru might be, so investigators began to lean toward the theory that they were dealing with a kidnapping. First of all, detectives checked out Chris Lang, He was almost immediately ruled out as a suspect because he was in Minnesota, 300 miles from Grand Forks. From Chris, the police learned about the 2 phone calls Dru had made, that one had been abruptly interrupted, and that during the second, made a few hours later, wind noises and the sound of button pressing could be heard. The next day, when the mall where Dru worked opened, the detectives arrived there to review the security camera footage. As it turned out, there were no security cameras in the parking lot where the missing girl's car was parked, but fortunately, there were quite a few security cameras inside the mall. Going through the footage, detectives found a moment when Dru went into one of the local stores after work, where she bought herself a purse. She was calm and in no hurry to go anywhere. She was wearing a pink sweater and was holding a jacket. At 4:55 p.m., Dru paid for her purchase at the register, then put on her jacket and left the store. On her way out, she called Chris. The call was made at exactly 5 p.m., and as we now know, at 5:04 p.m., the conversation between Dru and Chris was abruptly interrupted after she said, "Okay." Knowing that the call was interrupted after 4 minutes, one of the detectives decided to conduct an experiment. Setting the timer for 4 minutes, he began walking slowly from the store where Dru had bought her purse to the parking lot where her car was parked. When the alarm sounded indicating that 4 minutes had passed, the detective was in the parking lot near where the car had been found. This indicated that something had happened while Dru was at her car. However, as mentioned earlier, there were no cameras overlooking the parking lot, and that made it difficult to investigate. Dru's disappearance attracted media attention, and as a result, a huge number of people learned about what had happened to her, many of whom decided not to remain indifferent to someone else's misfortune. In addition to police officers, over 1,000 volunteers participated in the search for Dru. FBI officers also joined the investigation. The last call that was made from Dru's phone was traced to the small town of Fisher in neighboring Minnesota, which is only a 30-minute drive from the mall where she worked. As you can see on the map, the area around these 2 towns is occupied by fields. Police used helicopters, all-terrain vehicles, horses, and dogs to explore these fields. The landowners were asked to check their properties themselves, but unfortunately this was inconclusive, and at first, no leads could be found. The search radius increased with each new day, and 4 days later, an ominous discovery was made. A boot was found under a bridge in the town of Crookston. A roommate noted that on the day of her disappearance, Dru had left the house wearing those boots. Later, the fact that the shoe belonged to the missing girl was confirmed by forensics. Crookston is a small town of less than 10,000 people. It is located about 30 miles from Grand Forks, where Dru disappeared from. Further searches in the Crookston area yielded no results, as there was nothing of investigative interest to be found. A reward of $20,000 was initially offered for information that would help to determine Dru's whereabouts, and then the reward was increased to $140,000. At this point, the only clue that could lead to Dru was the surveillance footage at Columbia Mall. The detectives again sat down to watch hundreds of hours of footage from various cameras, but this time they decided to focus their attention not on Dru. They speculated that whoever abducted her may have been following her and may also have been on the videos. The investigators spent hours at the monitors before they saw the person who had caught their attention. They noticed a man walking aimlessly around the mall. He was not buying anything and seemed to be looking more at the people around him than at the merchandise being sold. At 3:41 p.m., he sat down on a bench near the mall exit and continued to watch people casually walk past him. After about 10 minutes, he got up from the bench and, wearing black gloves on his hands, walked out into the lobby, where there was a camera hanging overhead, into which he looked. This shot was taken 72 minutes before Dru's conversation with her boyfriend was interrupted, and she disappeared. After watching the man get up from his seat and walk away, investigators noticed that he only did so when a blonde woman walked past him, carrying a grocery cart heading in the direction of the parking lot. Detectives did not consider this a coincidence. Rather, in their opinion, the man seemed to have chosen a suitable victim and followed her. The identity of this woman was unknown, but police were aware that only one person, Dru Sjodin, had disappeared from the mall parking lot that day. Given the slight resemblance between Dru and the woman this suspicious man was following, it has been suggested that he had a particular image of the victim. If the kidnapper really was this man, and if for some reason he had failed to kidnap this woman, his next target might have been Dru. She had left the mall around 5 p.m., a time when it was already dark, which might have played into the hands of the perpetrator. At this point in the investigation, there were 3 cities in the case: Grand Forks, where Dru was kidnapped; Fisher, where her phone was last active; and Crookston, where the shoe was found. With this data in mind, the FBI began checking the files of all registered sex offenders from these cities and their environs. Comparing the photos from the files with the image of the suspicious man from the mall, there was only one man who matched all the parameters, and that was Alfonso Rodriguez Jr., who had an extensive criminal history of repeated crimes against women. The 50-year-old man had spent the last 23 years behind bars. Rodriguez was the second oldest of 5 children born in Laredo, Texas in February 1953, to migrant workers Dolores and Alfonso Rodriguez Sr. Alfonso Rodriguez Jr. claimed to have had an unhappy childhood, describing his home life as unpleasant because his parents were highly critical of him and unreasonable in their demands. His family moved from state to state for 15 years until they finally settled in Crookston in 1963. Rodriguez became increasingly isolated while growing up, which was further compounded by language barriers. His preferred language was Spanish, and he struggled with English, which made school especially challenging. He eventually dropped out of school during the 9th grade and began working as a laborer at the American Crystal Sugar Company plant in Crookston. Rodriguez claimed that he was molested by older women during his youth, which he said was the source of his hostile feelings against women. In October 1974, at the age of 21, he asked a woman for a ride home, but instead directed her to the driveway in Crookston, where he grabbed her by the throat and tried to force her to please him. The next month, he approached another woman who was sitting in a truck outside of a Crookston movie theater. He threatened her with a knife and ordered her to a secluded spot in the countryside where he forced her to have intercourse with him. Then, in 1979, he tried to kidnap a 69-year-old high school English teacher while she was out walking one night in Crookston. The woman fought back as Rodriguez tried to force her into his car. In a fit of anger, he stabbed her with a knife in her elbow and abdomen, yet she managed to break free and run to safety. The woman, who was artistically talented, was able to draw a composite sketch of Rodriguez that closely resembled him and led to his capture. He was convicted of attempted kidnapping and aggravated assault and sent to prison for 23 years until his release in May 2003. He had been released from prison 6 months before Dru disappeared and was registered as a sex offender of the highest 3rd degree, which meant that his risk of reoffending was as high as possible. Before his release from prison, Rodriguez's family voiced their concerns to Minnesota Department of Corrections officials. Even his family feared that he was going back to his old ways. But despite their fears, Alfonso was released because he had served his entire sentence. After his release, Rodriguez lived with his mother in Crookston, just a couple of miles from the bridge where, it should be recalled, Dru's shoe had been found, which was another factor not in his favor. The detectives decided to talk to Alfonso Rodriguez, and of course, he denied any involvement in Dru's disappearance. The man confirmed that he had been at the Columbia Mall the day she disappeared, saying that he had gone to the movie theater and watched the movie Once Upon a Time in Mexico. What he didn't consider was that none of the movie theaters in Grand Forks were showing the movie that day. Police searched Rodriguez's car and realized with regret that Dru was probably no longer alive. "It looks, at this time, like there's no chance we're going to find Dru alive," Grand Forks County Sheriff Dan Hill told reporters. "I believe that it is more of a recovery than a rescue mission at this point in time." In Rodriguez's car, dark red dried stains were found in several places in the interior, which forensics later determined were drops of Dru's blood. The affidavit says blood was found on the passenger side rear window and in the back seat, as well as 2 other areas in the passenger compartment. The blood did come back, "It was a DNA match with Dru from the DNA taken from Dru's toothbrush," the sheriff said. A folding knife was found in the trunk, which matched the sheath found in the parking lot next to Dru's car. A receipt was also found indicating that Rodriguez had purchased this knife, complete with its sheath, from a hardware store located several hundred yards from the parking lot where Dru disappeared. Although Dru was not found alive or dead, investigators gathered enough evidence to charge Rodriguez. 8 days after she disappeared, on December 1, 2003, the man was arrested. Rodriguez, who was imprisoned in a Grand Forks jail, claimed that he was not involved in Dru's disappearance and refused to speak to law enforcement officials or provide information as to her whereabouts despite the evidence against him. During a brief bond hearing several days earlier, bail for Rodriguez's release was set at a staggering $5 million. While he remained silent in custody, the search for Dru continued unabated and focused around these 3 towns. The work of the searchers was made more difficult by the snow that covered the area abundantly. In an unprecedented move, the governors of North Dakota and Minnesota pledged during a December 9th press conference to aid in the search for Dru by employing several hundred members of the National Guard and other state employees. North Dakota Governor John Hoeven said that Dru's disappearance was something that has touched every North Dakotan. Minnesota Governor Tim Pawlenty told reporters that he was very proud of the cooperation and the collaboration that's been exhibited by members of the community and police officials. Despite all the efforts made, there were no results, and due to worsening weather conditions, the authorities decided to suspend the search operation. In spring, the intensive search continued. Those searching for Dru hoped they would be able to find her, as the winter snow had just begun to melt. After 5 long months of searching, they were eager to return Dru home. Finally, on April 17, 2004, Dru's body was found. It lay in a field in Crookston, just a few miles from the bridge under which the boot had been found. Dru's family was overwhelmed with grief upon hearing of the heart-wrenching discovery. Her father told reporters, "We were waiting for that call, and when that call came, we all stopped living for a second. It was her parents' worst nightmare, and one that would haunt them for the rest of their lives." The field where the body was found had already been searched, but apparently because of the large drifts, they could not find it immediately. Dru was naked below the waist, which made the motive of the crime obvious. Her hands were tied behind her back, and there was a rope around her neck and a cut. Under the rope were the remnants of a plastic bag, indicating that the bag had first been put over Dru's head and then tied around her neck with a rope. Hair matching Rodriguez's DNA was found on Dru's jacket. Before she died, the young woman had been brutally beaten and stabbed repeatedly. The medical examiner listed 3 possible causes of her death. It was either the cut on her neck, suffocation, or the third possible cause, which was hypothermia. On April 24, 2004, after many months without a word, Dru's family was able to say goodbye to her. About 1,500 people attended the mourning ceremony. North Dakota, where Dru was kidnapped, abolished the death penalty back in 1975. Minnesota, where the body was found, did not use the death penalty as a punishment either. However, because Dru had been transported across state lines, the crime was considered a federal crime, and therefore the prosecutor's office had the right to seek the death penalty for Rodriguez. On August 30, 2006, Alfonso Rodriguez Jr. was convicted in the Dru Sjodin case. The jury recommended that he be sentenced to death. On February 8, 2007, Judge Ralph Erickson, during the hearing, told the unconfessing Rodriguez that his senseless and violent actions caused the jury and the court to make a difficult decision. Alfonso Rodriguez Jr. became the first person sentenced to death in the state of North Dakota in nearly a century. After 6 years on death row, on June 28, 2013, Rodriguez confessed that he was the one who kidnapped and took Dru's life. However, the story doesn't end there. Ralph Erickson, who had previously been the district judge who sentenced Rodriguez to death, became a U.S. Court of Appeals judge, And it was he who in 2021 overturned his own conviction of Rodriguez and ordered a new sentencing phase. Rodriguez's guilt is not in doubt and has been confirmed by various types of DNA testing. In this case, it is the death penalty that is at issue. Erickson overturned the death sentence, citing, among other things, the failure of defense attorneys to properly examine Rodriguez's mental health and the testimony of forensic expert Michael McGee, which the judge himself said misled him. This is the expert's testimony, which stated at the time that Rodriguez violated Dru's sexual integrity within 24 to 36 hours of the abduction. The fact is that there was no direct evidence to support this, such as Rodriguez's seminal fluid on Dru's body. According to the judge, the expert gave his opinion, but it was not supported by the facts, which misled the judge and influenced his verdict. Still, in reversing the death sentence, Erickson noted that even without the presence of Rodriguez's seminal fluid, the circumstances in which Dru's body was found, naked below the waist with her hands tied behind her back, were indicative of a sexually motivated crime. Judge Erickson said that the failure to examine Rodriguez's mental health, both generally and at the time of his crime, was a violation of his constitutional rights. After Rodriguez's death sentence was overturned, the federal prosecutor's office issued a statement saying they would seek the death penalty for him again. However, 2 years later, in 2023, the prosecutors abandoned those plans and accepted that Alfonso Rodriguez's death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. A statement to that effect was issued, which said, "The United States of America, by Max Schneider, United States Attorney for the District of North Dakota, hereby withdraws the notice of intent to seek a sentence of death against defendant Alfonso Rodriguez Jr., filed on October 28, 2004, Schneider wrote in a March 14 court filing. The United States no longer intends to seek the death penalty in this case. My thoughts today are with Dru Sjodin's family, particularly her parents, Linda Walker and Alan Sjodin," said Schneider. "They are genuinely good people and loving parents who, in the wake of an unimaginable loss, have worked closely with our office for nearly 20 years. We continue to wish them the greatest measure of peace possible. I also want to commend the trial team, including former United States Attorney Drew Wrigley, as well as our office's appellate attorneys and support staff. Over the last 2 decades, they have continuously upheld the high standards of the Department of Justice through their work on this tragic case. As a result of their efforts, Mr. Rodriguez is and will remain a convicted murderer. The directive to withdraw the death notice has changed how the United States Attorney's Office will proceed with this case. What will not change is that Mr. Rodriguez will draw his last breath in a federal prison. This case led to changes in sex offender registration laws. On July 27, 2006, President George Bush signed the Adam Walsh Child Protection and Safety Act, which included Dru's Law. Dru's Law changed the name of the National Sex Offender Public Registry to the Dru Sjodin National Sex Offender Public website, which provides information to the public on the whereabouts of registered sex offenders, regardless of state, territory, or tribal boundaries. On June 22, 2013, news broke that Alfonso Rodriguez had been transferred from death row prison in Terre Haute, Indiana, to Coleman II, a high-security penitentiary in Sumterville, Florida. This is where it looks like he will spend his last days.